Hello, my name is David. I just uploaded my animated short film, Merry Madness. I needed to design two monsters for the film, the Great Rat and the Terrible Hound. This video will cover my creative process bringing the Great Rat to life. Just like my video covering the Terrible Hound's design, this video will cover the idea behind the character, following into the reference I gathered, my designs, my drawings, my choice of colour and my full 3D clay sculpture. The whole process culminates in the walking, talking creature featured in the animated short film itself. Enjoy! This short film was heavily inspired by the films of Guillermo del Toro, but for the character of the rat specifically, Jim Henson's work ended up being a far bigger influence. Jim Henson's The Storyteller was a TV series from the 80s about an old man played by John Hurt telling ancient European folktales. Stories of griffins and lake monsters, stories of great and terrible, and stories of running out of stories. That character, the storyteller, was almost exactly what I was looking for in The Great Rat. And it doesn't even stop there. Jim Henson's The Dark Crystal features a race called the Mystics. The artwork by Brian Froud for the Mystics was another huge inspiration when I started working on the rat. The Mystics are wise and old, they're brown and beige, and they're artistic and reclusive. There are a lot of parallels between the two. I also, of course, took trips to visit museums. Kelvingrove Museum in Glasgow and the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. I did drawings and I took pictures. Edinburgh Museum specifically has a fantastic collection of taxidermy animals, and simply walking around the place is brilliant for forming some monster design inspiration. I wanted the rat to look like a real animal that could have evolved, to contrast to the hound, which looks like an unnatural blend of different species from different times. To pull this off, I looked exclusively at mammals when it came to animal reference when designing the rat. Strangely enough, I barely looked into rodents. I mostly looked at big cats and monkeys and different kinds of apes. After all of the research was gathered and my ideas were in place, I started to design my monster. I had decided on a very particular hunchbacked gargoyle-like body structure really early on that I really liked, so most of my sketches are of his head and face. I wanted a big, empathetic head to attach to that body, and I really struggled with designing the face. My earlier drawings are longer snouted and more cat-like, but slowly, over the course of the sketchbook, I seem to transition into a more flat, more ape-like face, something more empathizable to us fellow apes. It was a nightmare designing a face that I liked, a face that was distinctive and old and friendly and likeable, when suddenly, out of nowhere, I drew this quick profile view inspired by a mandrill and I really liked it. I finally found the Great Rat's face. With all of that done, I did a couple of watercolour mock-ups for the character, including this full-body watercolour illustration, and I was finally happy to move on. I wasn't totally convinced that this drawing was the final design. I still felt like there were a lot of things missing, but it captured the Great Rat's character and personality well enough, and it was the drawing I was going to base my sculpture on. For the sculpture, I started with a bunch of cardboard tubes, covered them in air drying clay, waited for them to solidify and glued them all together. From this solid clay armature, I started bulking out his form, working on his musculature and sculpting his skin and his details. The head, again, was a nightmare. It took me 4 attempts to get it right. I have far more experience sculpting reptiles and dinosaurs and abominations. Rarely do I sculpt something so human with an actual face. These designs are forever evolving, and as I sculpted, I decided on a whim to add certain things, such as a bigger gut and a walking stick. I think that the potbelly, in retrospect, is the biggest thing missing from that watercolour mock-up. I painted him with basic spray paints and then went in with acrylics and brushes. I also added a whole bunch of mixed media elements to the sculpture as well, such as string and beads.
Hello.
Finally, I have my finished sculpture. He's pretty big, he's about 16 inches tall and is roughly in scale with my sculpture of the Hound, and I think they look fantastic together, which is kind of the whole point. Is an artist, a hermit, an introverted extrovert. He's a wise old man who loves telling stories and singing songs, but equally enjoys reading or painting. He has a very particular personality to his design. There's a sadness and an enthusiasm to him that I find extremely relatable. His aesthetic too, this tactile, dry look. It's woods and strings and beads and paint. They go hand in hand with his autumn brown and orange colour scheme, this sort of cold warmth. I love his design. He might be my favourite sculptor I've ever made. If he's not, he's a close second behind my 2018 Tyrannosaurus Rex. With the sculpture sat in front of me, I started 3D modelling, texturing and rigging the character to be used in the animated short film. This was a far more complicated process than that of the Hound. The rat is a far more complicated character and has a lot more subtleties to convey in the film. He has a face that needs to talk and blink and smile. He has lips and ears and fur, and on top of all of that, the character basically carries the whole short film. I put a lot of effort into the way the Great Rat performs in this animation. The bulk of his emotion comes from his face, not his body language, so I set out to create the best facial rig I possibly could. I think overall, this is some of the best, if not the best, facial animation I've ever done. You'll notice that I also gave him a pair of spectacles. He didn't originally have spectacles, none of my drawings have spectacles, my sculpture doesn't have spectacles, they were just something I added mid-animation and they stuck. Like I said, these designs are forever evolving. This character, unlike the Hound, needed to speak. He has a voice. I recorded the Great Rat's dialogue maybe 10 or 15 times until I was finally happy with his voice. I wasn't having problems with his accent or pitch or anything like that, but I was having problems with his emotional tone. I wanted to stay true to his life-loving, enthusiastic, old man artistic hermit personality. He's somewhat musical in his delivery, somewhat corny and very storyteller-like, but I also wanted him to come across as a bit desperate too.
It's been a long time since someone came to me for a story.
I wanted there to be a certain lonely enthusiasm to him, given that he's been alone for so long.
Okay, this here is one of my favourites. The story of the Rat and the Hound. A tale of great and terrible times.
I approached him as if he's an extrovert forced into introvertedness, and this is the first time he's talked to someone in a very long time. There's a sadness to him, and as they proceed into his home, his excitement in telling his wonderful stories again nearly completely overtakes him.
Many would come visit the Rat. He told stories, sang songs, poetry and paint and merry madness without reason. He often sat and told his tales to men and women and monsters alike.
He's desperate and he's overly enthusiastic. I didn't want his enthusiasm to get to the point of it becoming off-putting though, but rather to the point of like innocent pity. He's lonely and he wants to be happy. I wanted the big guy to be a little tragic and very sympathisable.
Monsters all different. Arguing and fighting, of course, completely at odds, but also laughing and dancing and alive.
I find it hard to call the Great Rat a monster. He is, of course, but I approached him far more like he was a character, which you could absolutely argue are essentially the same thing. But where I tend to draw the line of distinction between a character and a monster is the degree of symbolism they inherit. My monsters tend to be walking metaphors, and their actions and design reflect whatever they happen to be a symbol for. The Great Rat is a metaphor as well, a metaphor for long abandoned great and terrible times and creativity, but He's also a person with a voice and a history, with likes and dislikes. Every design choice I made was to reflect who he is, not what he is. The Great Rat is an ancient creature, perhaps hundreds of years old. He settled down under a rock on a hill and told stories of his adventures of great and terrible times to any passers-by that would listen. People were drawn to the rat. They were drawn to his art and his poetry and his song, and before long an entire town was built around the rock on the hill. But with the rat came his opposite. If the rat is all great, then the hound is all terrible. You cannot have one without the other. Each gives the other purpose. It was this mix of tales and torment, merry-making and madness that drew in such a wide array of different men and women and monsters to the town. This created stories, this created conflict, and this created life and beauty. But eventually, as everyone grew old, they tired of the world's magic, and the men and women rid of their monsters, and in abandoning their terrible, they lost their great. Their worlds became safe, but very square and very dull. The rat remains under his rock on the hill, a small pocket of colour in an otherwise grey, lifeless landscape. Surrounded by, trapped by those who have outgrown him, he's desperately trying to cling on to his great and his terrible, what most see as his arch enemy, his complete opposite, but also his other half. He's trying to save the very thing that gives him purpose, for without her, he would have no stories worthy to tell. Bringing these characters, these monsters, to life is a whole lot of fun. What started as an idea, a backstory and a description, then evolved into a drawing, and then another drawing, which led into another. Eventually that evolved into a full-body 3D clay sculpture and is now sitting on my shelf. And finally, through animation, this character that was originally a couple of words on a page is truly brought to life. The Great Rat is a walking, talking, smiling and frowning character. A real person with a voice and feelings and a history. It's been a very creative, very difficult, but extremely rewarding process bringing my imagination to life, and I kind of loved every single second of it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this extra insight into my monster making creative process. This sketchbook that I've been showing you covers my whole Merry Madness project. This covers the process of designing the rat, the process of designing the hound, the fabrication of my two sculptures, and then leads into the animated short film itself. If you'd like to read this sketchbook, the full thing, high resolution photographs of the entire book, it is available on my Patreon page. Feel free to check it out if you want. Bye guys.